Did you know that a medieval farmer was lucky to get 4 grains of wheat for every one they planted? Today, a modern farmer can get 40 or more. Their world was a constant struggle against starvation. A bad harvest wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Yet, they survived. They fed burgeoning towns and built cathedrals with the surplus from their fields. How did they do it? They didn't have chemical fertilizers, GPS-guided tractors, or genetically modified seeds. They had secrets. Not magic spells, but hard-won knowledge passed down through generations. These were secrets written in the soil, in the turn of the seasons, and in the sweat of their brows. What did they know about the earth that we have forgotten? How did they manage to create a bounty from a world we would find impossibly difficult? Their farming methods were a complex dance of community, ingenuity, and a deep, instinctual understanding of the land. Number 18, how did they keep their tools working? A farmer's tools were their life. They were not disposable. You couldn't just go to the store and buy a new one. A good scythe, a sturdy plow, a sharp axe. These were often a person's most valuable possessions, sometimes passed down from father to son. Losing or breaking a tool was a disaster. So they learned to maintain them. This wasn't a chore. It was a ritual. The most important secret was the whetstone. Every farmer carried one. A scythe or a sickle used for reaping grain had to be razor sharp. A dull blade would tear the stalks, not slice them. This would shake the grains from the head, losing precious food before it even reached the threshing floor. Historians like Joseph Geese and Francis Geese, in their book Life in a Medieval Village, describe how reapers would pause constantly every few minutes to run their whetstone along the blade's edge. It was a rhythmic, constant part of the work. The sound of sharpening steel was the sound of the harvest. But it was more than just sharpening. It was about understanding the material. Wood was the most common material for tools. Handles for axes, yokes for oxen, the body of the plow. They knew which wood was best for which job. Ash was strong and flexible, perfect for a spear shaft or an axe handle. Oak was hard and durable, good for the main beam of a plow. They learned to work with the grain of the wood, not against it. They learned how to season wood, letting it dry slowly for months or even years so it wouldn't crack or warp under strain. When a wooden part did break, it wasn't thrown away, it was repaired. They would splice in new pieces, bind cracks with wet leather that would shrink tight as it dried, or peg it together with wooden dowels. This skill is a form of carpentry we've largely lost, the art of mending rather than replacing. Metal parts like the plowshare that cut the earth were even more precious. Iron was expensive. A village might share a single blacksmith. The smith was a vital part of the community. They didn't just make new things. Their main job was repair. They would heat a broken plowshare in the forge, hammer it back into shape, and temper it to the right hardness. Archaeological finds from medieval farm sites, like the one at Warham Percy in England, a deserted medieval village studied for decades, show tools that have been repaired over and over again. You can see the hammer marks, the forge welds, where a new piece of iron was added to a worn-out part. They made their tools last for generations. A plow might have a beam from 100 years ago, but a share that was repaired just last season. This mindset is completely alien to our modern world of planned obsolescence. They built things to be fixed. They also understood the importance of cleaning and storage. A tool caked in mud would rust if it was metal, or rot if it was wood. At the end of a long day, the farmer would scrape the heavy clay off the moldboard of the plow. They would wipe down their scythe and oil it with animal fat to protect it from the damp night air. Tools weren't left out in the rain. They were stored in a dry barn or lean-to. This simple act of cleaning and storing properly could add years to the life of a tool. It was a discipline born of necessity. When your survival depends on a few pieces of wood and iron, you learn to treat them with respect. What do we still not know about this? We can analyze the metal in a surviving plowshare, but can we ever truly know the feel of a perfectly balanced, custom-made axe in the hands of the person who used it every day? How much knowledge about specific wood types and their properties, passed down only by word of mouth, has been lost forever? If a blacksmith repaired a tool, did they leave a maker's mark, and could we trace the life of a single tool across generations and different owners? Could the microscopic wear patterns on a medieval sickle tell us if the user was right-handed or left-handed, and how skilled they were at their job. Number 17, what if the worst pests weren't insects? We think of pests as bugs. We imagine medieval farmers battling locusts, caterpillars, and weevils. And they faced these things constantly. Weevils in the granary could ruin a winter's supply of food. Caterpillars could strip a kitchen garden bare in a few days. They had ways to deal with them. They used folk remedies like planting strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy around their crops to deter insects. They encouraged natural predators. They knew that a healthy population of birds and frogs would help keep insect numbers down. So medieval manuscripts even contain instructions for scaring birds away from newly sown fields, often employing young children as human scarecrows. But these were predictable problems. They were part of the natural cycle. The truly devastating pests were often much larger. The worst pests were often other people. The local lord was a constant drain on the harvest. A peasant farmer, or serf, didn't own their land. They worked it for a lord in exchange for protection. But this came at a cost. The lord demanded a share of the crop. This could be a tenth, a quarter, or even more. This wasn't a request, it was a requirement. The reeve, the lord's manager, would be there at harvest time to measure out the lord's portion before the farmer could take his own. Then there was the church demanded a tithe, which was 1/10 of everything produced. So before a farmer could even feed his own family, a huge chunk of his harvest was already gone. This is documented extensively in manorial records, the detailed accounts kept by estates. Documents like the records from the estates of the Bishop of Winchester in England, dating back to the 13th century, give us a clearer picture of these obligations. And then there were the lord's animals. The lord had the right to hunt across all the land in his manor, including the fields the peasants were farming. A hunting party with nobles on horseback and packs of dogs could thunder through a field of nearly ripe wheat, trampling a significant portion of a family's food supply for the year. There was nothing the farmer could do about it. The lord's pigeons were another menace. Lords built large dovecotes, housing hundreds of pigeons. These birds were a source of meat for the lord's table during the winter. But for the rest of the year, they would feast on the peasants' newly sown seeds and ripening grain. It was illegal for a peasant to kill the lord's pigeons, even if they were destroying his crops. This constant, unavoidable loss was a form of pestilence that no scarecrow could prevent. War was the ultimate pest. An army marching through a territory was like a swarm of locusts. Soldiers would forage for food, which meant they would take whatever they wanted. They would strip fields, steal livestock, and burn granaries. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, for example, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, caused widespread devastation to the French countryside. Chronicles from the period, like those of Jean Froissart, are filled with accounts of armies laying waste to the land. For a farmer, an approaching army meant losing everything. It wasn't just the loss of one harvest. It was the loss of seed for the next year, the loss of the oxen needed to plow the fields. It could set a family and a village back for a generation. Compared to this, a few caterpillars on a cabbage seemed like a minor problem. The greatest challenge wasn't fighting nature. It was surviving the demands of the powerful. How much of the average medieval harvest was actually lost to these human pests compared to natural ones? Can we quantify the psychological stress on farmers who knew a large portion of their hard work would be taken from them? And did this impact their farming methods? Were there subtle forms of resistance, like hiding grain or underreporting yields? And how would we ever find archaeological evidence of such acts? Beyond direct theft, how did the constant threat of war change what people chose to grow, perhaps favoring crops that could be harvested quickly or hidden more easily? Number 16, could you trust the sky more than a book? Most medieval farmers could not read or write. Their knowledge wasn't stored in books. It was stored in their memories, in their traditions, and in the world around them. Their calendar was not a piece of paper on the wall. It was the sun, the moon, and the stars. It was the budding of the trees, the arrival of migratory birds, and the feel of the soil. This was a deep, intimate form of literacy, a literacy of the land. They knew when to plant their barley, not because a calendar said it was April, but because the oak leaves were the size of a mouse's ear. This kind of folk wisdom is often dismissed, but it was based on centuries of careful observation. Generations of farmers had watched and learned, and passed that knowledge down. They used the sky as their clock, and compass, the position of the sun told them the time of day. The North Star guided them at night, but they also used celestial events to plan their farming year. The cycle of the moon was particularly important. Many believed that planting and harvesting should be done in accordance with lunar phases. While modern science is skeptical of many of these claims, the practice was universal. The Old Farmer's Almanac, first published in 1792, but based on much older traditions, is a modern remnant of this way of thinking. People planted root crops during the waning moon and above-ground crops during the waxing moon. Whether it worked or not, it provided a framework, a set of rules in a world of uncertainty. It gave them a sense of control. Saints' days were also crucial markers in the agricultural year. The church calendar was the backbone of medieval life. Important dates for planting, plowing, or harvesting were often tied to a particular saint's day. For example, the Feast of St. George on April 23rd was a common time for turning cattle out to pasture for the first time. The Feast of St. Michael, or Michaelmas, on September 29th was a major landmark at the end of the harvest season. It was when accounts were settled, rents were paid, and farm workers might be hired for the next year. These weren't arbitrary dates. They were chosen because they coincided with the natural rhythms of the agricultural season in Europe. The church, in a way, sanctified the existing pagan and folk calendars, making them easier to remember and enforce. The historian Homans, in his work English Villagers of the 13th century, details how the rhythms of the manorial court and agricultural work were completely intertwined with this religious calendar. This reliance on natural signs was also their primary weather forecasting service. They watched the behavior of animals, they looked at the color of the sky at sunset. A red sky at night was a shepherd's delight. A red sky in the morning was a shepherd's warning. They knew the patterns of the prevailing winds. They knew what a certain type of cloud formation meant. This wasn't superstition, it was pattern recognition. When you live your entire life outdoors, you become incredibly attuned to subtle changes in your environment. They could read the weather in a way we no longer can. Their survival depended on it. Sowing seeds just before a long dry spell or a major storm could be disastrous. Their ability to read the signs in the sky and on the land was their most advanced technology. But what happens when these ancient signs fail? How did they cope with truly anomalous weather events like the volcanic-induced cold and wet of the year 536, the worst year to be alive, which would have defied all traditional knowledge? Was there a scientific class of medieval weather watchers, old men and women, whose predictions were especially valued, and how did they gain their reputation? Could we analyze ice core or tree ring data and correlate it with historical records of famine to see just how accurate their folk forecasting actually was? When two pieces of folk wisdom contradicted each other, for example, what the moon said versus what the birds were doing, how did a farmer decide which one to trust? Number 15, why were the animals just as important as the crops? In the modern mind, farming is about plants. We think of fields of wheat, corn, and soybeans. But for a medieval farmer, animals were at the very center of the operation. Without them, the whole system would collapse. They weren't a separate enterprise. They were completely integrated into the cycle of growing crops. The most important animal on most farms was the ox, the heavy plow that opened up the rich, clay soils of northern Europe was too much for a man to pull. It required a team of animals. Oxen were the engines of medieval agriculture. They were slow but incredibly strong and steady. A farmer might own one ox, or even just a share in one. His neighbors would have others. They would pool their animals to create the teams of 4, 6, or even 8 oxen needed to break the soil in the spring. This is a key point made by historians of technology like Lynn White Jr. in his book Medieval Technology and Social Change. The need for cooperation to form plow teams shaped the very structure of the village community. Horses were also used, especially from the 10th century onwards. They were faster than oxen, but they were also more expensive to feed and care for. They required oats, while oxen could live on grass and straw. The development of the horse collar, which allowed the horse to pull with its shoulders instead of its neck, made it a much more efficient draft animal. But for most of the Middle Ages, for the average peasant, the slow, powerful ox was the key to survival. These animals weren't just for plowing. They pulled carts to take grain to the mill or to the market. They were the tractors and trucks of their day, but the contribution of animals went far beyond muscle power. Their manure was the primary fertilizer. In a world without chemical fertilizers, animal dung was black gold. It returned nutrients to the soil, keeping the fields productive year after year. The practice of folding was common. This meant keeping sheep or cattle in a temporary, movable pen on a fallow field at night. Their droppings and urine would be concentrated in that area, enriching the soil directly. The Domesday Book of 1086, a massive survey of England, often measured the wealth of a manor not just in acres of land, but in the number of plow teams it could support and the amount of pasture for livestock. This shows how intertwined crops and animals were in the medieval economy. Animals were also a walking savings account. They were a way to store wealth and food. If the grain harvest was poor, a family could slaughter a pig or a sheep to get through the winter. Pigs were particularly valuable. They were easy to keep. They could forage for themselves in the woods, eating acorns and roots. They were often called the peasant's pride because they could be fattened up with scraps and then provide meat, lard for cooking, and leather. Chickens provided a steady supply of eggs, a vital source of protein. Cows and goats gave milk, which could be made into cheese and butter, storable forms of calories. Wool from sheep was the basis of the entire textile industry, one of the biggest sectors of the medieval economy. Selling wool could provide a peasant family with the cash they needed to pay their rent or buy things they couldn't make themselves, like salt or iron. The animals were the farmer's insurance policy, their bank, and their partner in the field. Did medieval farmers understand the concept of a balanced diet for their animals, and how did they provide it without modern supplements? How did they practice veterinary medicine, and what was the survival rate for a sick cow or ox? We find animal bones in archaeological digs, but can we tell from them if the animals were generally healthy or suffering from chronic malnutrition? Was there a black market for livestock, a way for peasants to trade animals without the Lord's knowledge to avoid taxes or fees? Number 14, how did they stop their fields from drowning? Water is life, but too much water is just as bad as too little. One of the biggest challenges for farmers in many parts of Europe, especially in the north, was not drought, but drainage. The heavy clay soils that the moldboard plow could turn were fertile, but they held water. A waterlogged field would rot the seeds before they could sprout. It would drown the roots of growing plants. And you couldn't plow a field that was essentially a swamp. So a key to the agricultural expansion of the Middle Ages was the mastery of drainage. The most common technique was the ridge and furrow system. When you look at certain fields in England today, especially from the air, you can still see the landscape is not flat. It's a series of long curving ripples. These were created by medieval plowing techniques. The heavy moldboard plow didn't just cut the soil, it turned it over. By consistently plowing in a certain pattern, turning the sod towards the center of a strip of land, farmers would build up a raised ridge. The area between the ridges would form a shallow ditch or furrow. This had a brilliant effect. The water would run off the higher, drier ridges and collect in the furrows, draining away from the roots of the crops. The seeds were planted on the ridges, where they would be safe from waterlogging. This simple, ingenious system transformed vast areas of marginal damp land into productive farmland. The study of these surviving field systems, known as landscape archaeology, has revealed the sheer scale of this earth moving, which was done year after year, century after century. In flatter, even wetter areas like the fenlands of eastern England or the Low Countries of Holland and Flanders, more drastic measures were needed. This is where large-scale drainage projects began. Communities, often organized by monasteries, would work together to dig extensive networks of ditches and dikes. The Cistercian monks were famous for this. They often sought out remote, uncultivated land for their abbeys. They were master engineers and hydrologists. They would build systems of canals to divert rivers and drain marshes, creating new, incredibly fertile farmland from what was once wasteland. The sheer amount of labor involved is staggering. This wasn't done with bulldozers. It was done with shovels, with wooden spades, tipped with iron, and with human and animal power. The process could take generations. Maintaining these drainage systems was a constant job. Ditches would silt up, dikes could break. The manorial court records are full of cases where tenants were fined for not cleaning their section of a drainage ditch. It was a communal responsibility. If one person failed to maintain their part of the system, it could cause their neighbor's field to flood. This shared vulnerability forced people to work together. It bound the community in a web of mutual obligation. This wasn't just about farming, it was about civic engineering on a local scale. The success of a village often depended on how well they could manage their water. They also used water for irrigation in drier areas, but drainage was the more pressing problem in the regions that saw the biggest population growth during the High Middle Ages, c. 1000 to 1300. The ability to control water, to move it where you wanted it and get rid of it where you didn't, was a fundamental secret to their success. It wasn't as visible as a new plow or a different crop, but this quiet, muddy work of digging and clearing ditches was just as revolutionary. It literally created the land they farmed on. How did they survey the land to ensure their drainage ditches had the correct gentle slope to carry water away without causing erosion? Was this knowledge held by a few specialists, or was it common to all farmers? We can see the large ditches, but what about smaller subsurface drainage methods like filling trenches with stones or brushwood, which would leave little archaeological trace? How did villages resolve disputes when one person's drainage project inadvertently flooded a neighbor's land downstream? Number 13 was the most important farm actually in the backyard. When we think of medieval farming, we picture vast open fields of wheat and barley. These were the cash crops, the staples that fed the cities and paid the rent. But for the average family, the most important piece of land might have been the small plot right behind their house. This was the kitchen garden, sometimes called a toft or a croft. It was the domain of the women of the household, and it was the key to a family's day-to-day survival and health. While the men were working in the common fields, growing grain for the Lord, the women were intensely cultivating this small patch of land for the family's own table. This garden was not for growing wheat. It was for everything else. It was a miniature, highly diverse farm. Here they grew vegetables like leeks, onions, and garlic, which were the base of almost every medieval soup or pottage. They grew peas and beans, a vital source of protein. They grew leafy greens, which they called pot herbs, like cabbage and chard. These vegetables provided the essential vitamins and minerals that a diet of just bread would lack. The study of preserved medieval seeds and pollen, a field called archaeobotany, has given us a much clearer picture of what was grown in these gardens. For example, analysis of soil from the Coppergate dig in York, England, revealed seeds from over 100 different species of plants that would have been used for food, medicine, or dyeing, many of which would have come from these small gardens. The garden was also the family's pharmacy. They grew medicinal herbs. They knew that fennel could aid digestion, that chamomile could help with sleep, that yarrow could be used to stop bleeding. This knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter. It was a complex herbal medicine system that operated completely outside the world of university-trained physicians, who were only available to the very wealthy. For the vast majority of people, the cures for their ailments grew right outside their back door. It wasn't just plants. This small plot was also where they kept their animals. There would be a coop for a few chickens, providing precious eggs. There might be a pen for a pig being fattened on kitchen scraps. And crucially, there would be a beehive. Honey was the main sweetener of the medieval period. Sugar was an expensive imported luxury. Honey was used in cooking, for making meat and alcoholic drink, and for its medicinal properties. Beeswax was also incredibly valuable. It was used to make candles, especially the high-quality candles used in churches. A beehive was a small but significant source of income. The kitchen garden was a model of intensive, organic, and sustainable agriculture. The waste from the kitchen was fed to the pig. The pig's manure was used to fertilize the soil. The bees pollinated the bean blossoms. Nothing was wasted. It was a closed-loop system. While the open field system was about monoculture on a large scale, the garden was about polyculture and biodiversity on a small scale. It was the family's nutritional safety net. When the grain harvest was poor, a well-stocked kitchen garden could mean the difference between hunger and survival. It was the hidden, often unrecorded, heart of the medieval food system. What was the true nutritional value of the food produced in these gardens, and how much did it vary from season to season or region to region? How were new plants or seeds for these gardens shared between households and villages, spreading new food sources? And since this work was primarily done by women, how much of this vital agricultural knowledge has been lost because it was never written down by male chroniclers? Could a family actually survive for a whole year on just their garden produce if the main field crops completely failed? Or number 12, why did they cut trees to make them grow forever? A medieval farmer needed wood for everything. They needed it to build their house. They needed it to make their tools. They needed it to build their fences, and most importantly, they needed it for fuel to cook their food and heat their homes through the long, cold winters. But they couldn't just cut down the forest. The great forests were often the property of the king or the local lord, reserved for hunting. Cutting down a tree in the lord's forest without permission could get you fined, flogged, or worse. So they had to find a way to get a sustainable supply of wood from a limited number of trees. Their solution was ingenious. They learned to cut trees in a way that didn't kill them. They used two main techniques, coppicing and pollarding. Coppicing involved cutting a tree down to a stump close to the ground. This sounds destructive, but for many species of deciduous trees like hazel, ash, and oak, it stimulates the root system to send up multiple new shoots. These shoots grow straight and fast. In a few years, maybe 7 to 15, they would be ready to harvest. They were the perfect size for firewood, for making the wattle panels used in house construction, or for making tool handles. And when they were cut, the stump or stool would simply send up a new crop of shoots. A single coppiced tree could be harvested over and over again for hundreds of years. It was a renewable resource in the truest sense. Archaeologists have found ancient coppice stools in English woodlands that are over 1,000 years old, still alive and producing. Pollarding was a similar technique, but instead of cutting the tree near the ground, they cut it higher up, maybe 6 to 10 feet from the ground. This had a key advantage. The new shoots would regrow above the reach of browsing animals like deer or cattle. This meant you could manage your woodland for wood products while still using the land beneath for grazing your animals. It was a way of getting two harvests from the same piece of land. You can still see old pollarded trees in the European countryside, especially in England. They have a distinctive shape, a short fat trunk with a crown of new branches growing out of the top. This wasn't just a random practice, it was a highly organized system. A village's woodland would be divided into sections. Each year they would cut one section, the next year they would move to the next section. By the time they had cut the last section, the first one had regrown and was ready to be harvested again. This is called coppice with standards rotation. They would also leave a few trees in each section, the standards, to grow into large timber trees for building. The historian Oliver Rackham, in his groundbreaking book, The History of the Countryside, showed that this system was not only sustainable, but also created a unique habitat that was incredibly rich in biodiversity. The cycle of cutting allowed sunlight to reach the woodland floor, promoting the growth of wildflowers and providing a home for insects and birds. A managed medieval woodland was healthier and more diverse than a dark, unmanaged forest. They had created a system that produced what they needed, while also enhancing the environment. It was a secret that modern conservationists are now relearning. How did they decide on the optimal rotation period for different tree species in different climates and soil types? Was this knowledge passed down, or was it a process of constant trial and error? What legal and social systems were in place to prevent one person from cutting a section of the woodland before its designated time? We know what species they used, but did they have specific named varieties of trees that were known to be particularly good for coppicing, much like we have named varieties of apples? Number 11, did they know beans were magic for the soil? Every farmer knows that if you plant the same crop in the same field year after year, the yields will eventually decline. The plants use up the nutrients in the soil. Even in the Middle Ages, they knew this. Their primary way of dealing with it was to leave a field fallow, unplanted, to let it rest. But they also had another secret weapon in their fight against soil exhaustion: legumes. This is a family of plants that includes peas, beans, and vetches. They didn't know the science behind it. They didn't know about nitrogen-fixing bacteria living in nodules on the roots of these plants. But they knew it worked. They observed that planting a field with beans or peas one year seemed to make the soil richer for the wheat or barley they planted the next year. This discovery was a cornerstone of the three-field system, a major agricultural innovation that spread across Europe from about the 9th century onwards. In the old two-field system, a farmer would plant half their land and leave the other half fallow. With the three-field system, they divided their land into 3 parts. In a typical year, one field would be planted in the autumn with a grain like wheat or rye. The second field would be planted in the spring with a different crop, often oats or barley, but increasingly with peas or beans. The third field would be left fallow. The next year, they would rotate. The fallow field would get the autumn grain, the grain field would get the spring crop, and the spring crop field would be left fallow. The French historian Marc Bloch, in his classic work Feudal Society, argued that this system was truly revolutionary. First, it increased the amount of land under cultivation at any one time from 1/2 to 2/3. That's a huge jump in productivity. Second, it diversified their crops. Having both an autumn sown and a spring sown crop was a brilliant risk management strategy. If a long, wet winter damaged the wheat, They still had a chance of a good harvest from their spring-sown oats. But the inclusion of legumes was the real game changer. It wasn't just about having another food source. The peas and beans were actively fertilizing the soil. They were pumping nitrogen, a key nutrient for plant growth, back into the ground. A field that had been planted with beans one year would give a much better wheat yield the next. This had a profound impact on the medieval diet and population. Beans and peas are high in protein. When eaten with bread, they provide a complete protein, similar to what you would get from meat. This meant that the average peasant had access to better nutrition. Better nutrition meant people were healthier, lived longer, and had more children. The surplus food and the growing population it supported were arguably what fueled the growth of towns, the building of cathedrals, and the expansion of the High Middle Ages. It's not an exaggeration to say that this agricultural system, with the humble being at its heart, helped build medieval civilization. They didn't have a laboratory, but through careful observation, they had unlocked one of nature's most powerful secrets for maintaining fertility. How did the practice of planting legumes spread? Was it a top-down innovation ordered by a lord, or a grassroots movement that spread from village to village? Did they notice that some legumes were better for the soil than others, and did they select for these traits? We know they ate the peas and beans, but did they also practice green manuring, plowing the legume crop back into the soil specifically to fertilize it, and how would we find evidence for that? Could the specific strains of nitrogen-fixing bacteria present in medieval soils have been different, perhaps more effective, than those we have today? Number 10. How did they breed better plants without knowing about DNA? Medieval farmers were not passive recipients of whatever seeds they had. They were active participants in the evolution of their crops. They didn't know about genes or genetics. The work of Gregor Mendel with his pea plants was centuries in the future. But they understood the basic principle of heredity, like baguettes like. They were practical, observant people. At harvest time, they could see that some stalks of wheat were taller, with plumper heads of grain. They could see that some pea plants produced more pods, and they used this knowledge. The most important secret was seed selection. When they harvested their grain, they didn't just throw it all into a sack. They would set aside the very best part of the harvest to use as seed for the next year's crop. They would consciously choose seeds from the most vigorous, healthy, and high-yielding plants. This was a slow, patient process of selective breeding. Over generations, this constant selection would gradually improve the quality of their crops. The wheat grown in 1300 was likely hardier and more productive than the wheat grown in 900. It had been adapted year by year to the specific soil and climate of that particular village. This created thousands of local varieties, or land races, of crops. Each valley, each region, had its own unique strain of wheat, barley, or rye, perfectly suited to that environment. This is a form of biodiversity that we have largely lost in our modern world of standardized hybrid seeds. They also understood how to maintain the purity of their seed stock. They knew that if you planted two different types of cabbage too close together, the seeds they produced would grow into strange, unpredictable plants the next year. They understood the basics of cross-pollination, even if they didn't know the term. They would try to keep their different varieties separate. For grain, which is wind-pollinated, this was harder, but for garden vegetables, it was a common practice. This process of selection wasn't just for yield, they selected for other traits as well. They might choose seeds from plants whose grain was easiest to thresh. They might select for stalks with strong straw that could be used for thatching roofs. In a northern climate, they would naturally select for plants that matured earlier to avoid the autumn frosts. In a dry region, they would unconsciously be selecting for drought resistance. This wasn't a formal scientific program. It was a continuous, subtle process embedded in the annual cycle of farming. Treatises on agriculture from the period, like Walter of Henley's Husbandry, written in the 13th century, give advice on choosing good seed, showing that this was a conscious and well-understood practice among the more educated managers of large estates, and likely common knowledge among all farmers. The result of this was a harvest that was reliable, if not spectacular, by our standards. Their locally adapted landraces were resilient. They might not have had the massive yield potential of a modern hybrid, but they were tough. They could handle a bit of drought, a bit of disease, and the specific challenges of their home environment. The farmers had, in effect, programmed their crops to succeed in their world, one handful of selected seeds at a time. How fast Could these crop improvements actually happen? Could a few generations of careful selection make a noticeable difference in yield? Did they trade these locally improved seeds with neighboring villages? And if so, how did that network operate? Is it possible that some of these most medieval land races contained valuable genetic traits like disease resistance that are missing from our modern monocultures? Can we use DNA analysis on ancient grains found in archaeological sites to reconstruct their genetic makeup and see how they differ from their wild ancestors and modern descendants? Number 9. Why was leftover grain a matter of life and death? After the reapers had gone through the field with their sickles and scythes, the harvest was not over. The field was not empty. Inevitably, some stalks of grain were missed, some heads of grain were dropped. To our modern, mechanized eyes, this would look like waste. But in the medieval world, this leftover grain was a vital part of the food system. The practice of collecting it was called gleaning, and it was a right, not a privilege. Gleaning was reserved for the poorest members of the community: widows, orphans, the elderly, and those who had no land of their own. After the Lord's men had officially declared the harvest collected, these people were allowed to enter the fields and gather what was left. This was a form of social security, a way for the community to take care of its most vulnerable. It was deeply embedded in social custom and even in religious law. The Bible in the book of Leviticus explicitly commands farmers not to reap the very edges of their fields or gather the gleanings of their harvest, but to leave them for the poor. This ancient tradition was carried through into the medieval period and was a cornerstone of village life. The amount of grain that could be collected this way was not trivial. For a family with no other source of food, the gleanings from the harvest could be enough to provide them with bread for a significant part of the winter. It was back-breaking work. It meant spending all day, day after day, bent over, searching for single stalks and heads of grain under the hot sun. But it was a matter of survival. The French painter Jean-François Millet's famous 19th century painting, The Gleaners, depicts this timeless scene showing the hard labor involved. While painted much later, the activity he shows had not changed for centuries. The right to glean was so important that it was often a source of conflict. The landowners and larger farmers naturally wanted to minimize the amount of grain left in the fields. They wanted the reaping to be as efficient as possible. The poor, on the other hand, depended on a certain amount of waste. Manorial court records sometimes show disputes over gleaning. For example, people might be accused of gleaning before their time, meaning they went into the fields before the harvest was officially declared over. This was considered a form of theft. The rules were strict, but the existence of these rules shows how widespread and regulated the practice was. Gleaning reveals a different way of thinking about efficiency and waste. Our modern system aims for 100% efficiency. A combine harvester is designed to capture every last grain. Any loss is a monetary loss for the farmer. The medieval system had a built-in accepted level of inefficiency. This waste was not a loss to the system as a whole. It was a redistribution mechanism. It ensured that even those with no land had a stake in the harvest and a means to survive. It was a secret to community resilience. It bound the rich and the poor together in a shared dependency on the land and on each other. It turned a potential source of waste into a lifeline. Just how much grain, as a percentage of the total harvest, was typically collected by gleaners? Did this percentage change depending on the wealth of the village or the strictness of the lord? Were there social hierarchies among the gleaners themselves, with certain families claiming rights to certain parts of a field? Besides grain, what other crops were subject to the laws of gleaning, and did this apply to the lord's private garden as well as the common fields? Number 8, could you really farm without owning any land? The idea of private property is central to our modern world. We think of a farm as a piece of land owned by an individual. But for many medieval peasants, this concept would have been strange. They didn't own the land in the way we think of ownership. The ultimate owner was the lord of the manor, or the king. A peasant family might have the right to farm a certain number of strips in the great open fields, but they didn't own them. And yet, there was a part of the landscape that in a practical sense belonged to everyone. This was the commons. The commons were a vital part of the medieval village economy. It was an area of land, usually pasture, meadow, or woodland, that was not divided into individual strips. It was used collectively by the community. Every villager or commoner had certain rights to use this land. The most important right was the right of pasture. A peasant could graze their animals, their ox, their cow, a few sheep on the common pasture. This was crucial. Without the commons, a poor family would have no way to feed their animals. And without their animals, they couldn't plow their strips in the open fields. The commons provided more than just grazing. The villagers had the right of estover, which was the right to gather firewood from the common woodland. They had the right of pannage, which was the right to let their pigs forage for acorns in the autumn. They could cut turf or peat from the common for fuel. They could gather wild berries, nuts, and mushrooms. They could fish in the common streams. The commons were a shared natural resource that provided all the essential things that the cultivated fields did not. The historian W.G. Hoskins, a pioneer in the study of the English landscape, emphasized how the commons were an integral part of a balanced and sustainable agricultural system. This system was not a free-for-all. It was carefully regulated by the community. There were rules about how many animals each family could put on the common. This was called a stint. Your stint was often based on the number of acres you farmed in the open fields. This was to prevent one person from overgrazing the common and ruining it for everyone. These rules were enforced by the manorial court. This system is a classic example of what the political scientist Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winner, studied how communities can successfully manage a shared resource without it being destroyed by overuse, a phenomenon often called the tragedy of the commons. For centuries, these medieval villages proved it was possible. The commons were a source of independence and a safety net. They made it possible for even the poorest families to keep a few animals and supplement their diet. They fostered a strong sense of community as everyone had a shared interest in maintaining this resource. The gradual enclosure of the commons, a process that started in the late Middle Ages and accelerated in later centuries, was a social and economic disaster for the rural poor. It took away their means of subsistence and forced them to become landless wage laborers. The secret of the commons was that it recognized that some resources are too important to be privately owned. They are best managed by the community for the benefit of all. How were the stints or grazing rights originally determined, and how did they adapt to a growing or shrinking village population? What were the most common sources of conflict over the commons, and how were they resolved in the manorial court? Did the ecological health of the commons decline over time, or was the medieval management system truly sustainable over centuries? If a new family moved to the village, how did they acquire rights to use the commons? Number 7. What did wind and water have to do with bread? A bountiful harvest of wheat was useless if you couldn't turn it into flour. The process of grinding grain by hand is incredibly laborious. Using a small, hand-turned quern, it could take a woman hours of hard work every day to produce enough flour for her family. This was a major bottleneck in the food production system. The solution was to harness a power greater than human muscle, the power of water and wind. The mill was one of the most important pieces of technology in the medieval world. Water mills were not a medieval invention. The Romans had them, but it was during the Middle Ages that their use became widespread. By the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, there were over 5,000 water mills recorded in England alone. That's about one mill for every 50 households. They were everywhere. A mill was a complex piece of machinery with a water wheel, gears, and a set of heavy millstones. The flow of a river or stream would turn the wheel, which would turn the gears, which would turn the top millstone, grinding the grain against the stationary bottom stone. This could do the work of dozens of people, and it freed up that human labor, particularly women's labor, for other tasks. The mill, however, came with a catch. The peasant farmer almost never owned the mill. The mill was owned by the lord of the manor, and the lord had a monopoly. This was called the right of banality. All the tenants on the manor were required to bring their grain to the lord's mill to be ground, and they had to pay for the service. The payment was usually a portion of the flour known as multure. The miller, who worked for the lord, would take a scoop from every sack. This was a major source of income for the lord and a major source of resentment for the peasants. Millers, in medieval literature, like in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, are almost always portrayed as greedy and dishonest, accused of taking more than their fair share. That peasants were sometimes caught with illegal hand querns, trying to avoid the lord's mill. The fact that they would risk a fine to grind their own grain shows how much they disliked the system. In areas without reliable rivers, a different solution emerged: the windmill. The post mill, an early type of windmill, was invented in the 12th century. The entire body of the mill, which contained the machinery, was mounted on a single large post. This allowed the whole structure to be turned so that the sails could face into the wind. This was a brilliant piece of engineering, allowing people to harness an even more unpredictable power source. Windmills became a common feature of the landscape in places like the Low Countries, Spain, and eastern England. Whether powered by wind or water, the mill represented a fundamental shift. It was the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages. It was a concentration of capital and technology. It took a process that was once done in every home and centralized it. It created a new source of power, both literally in the grinding of grain and socially in the wealth and control it gave to the Lord. The daily bread on a peasant's table was a product not just of the field, but of this powerful and often controversial machine. How did the knowledge of how to build and maintain these complex mills get passed on? Were millwrights a secretive and highly paid guild of craftsmen? What was the real average amount of flour a miller took as payment, and were the stories of their cheating exaggerated? Could a sudden change in a river's course or a long period of calm weather cause a flour famine in a village, even if the granaries were full of grain? How did the noise and vibration from a watermill affect the local river ecosystem? Number 6, how did a better harness change civilization? For much of ancient history, the horse was not a very effective farm animal. It was used for riding and for pulling chariots, but it was not good at pulling a heavy plow. The reason was the harness. The ancient throat and girth harness was designed for pulling light loads. When a horse tried to pull something heavy, the strap would press against its windpipe, effectively choking it. The harder it pulled, the less air it could get. This severely limited the horse's usefulness as a draft animal. Oxen, who could pull with their shoulders against a yoke, remained the superior beast of burden. Then, sometime in the early Middle Ages, a series of innovations came together to create a new system that would transform the role of the horse. The first was the rigid padded horse collar. This invention, which seems to have come to Europe from Asia, was a complete game changer. The collar rested on the horse's strong shoulders, allowing it to put its full weight into pulling without any pressure on its windpipe. A horse with a modern collar can pull a load 4 to 5 times heavier than a horse with the old harness. Suddenly, the horse was not just an alternative to the ox, it was a superior one. But the collar was only part of the solution. The other key invention was the horseshoe. A horse's hooves are softer than an ox's and can be easily damaged by work on hard or wet ground. Nailing iron shoes to the horse's hooves protected them, allowing the horse to work longer and on more difficult terrain. The final piece of the puzzle was the practice of harnessing horses in a line, one behind the other, rather than side by side. This allowed a team of horses to apply their force much more efficiently to the plow. The impact of this new horse harnessing system was enormous, as argued by the historian Lynn White Jr. A horse is much faster than an ox. A team of horses could plow almost twice as much land in a day as a team of oxen. This meant a farmer could manage a larger farm. It meant that the plowing could be done more quickly, allowing farmers to take better advantage of good weather. The speed of the horse also transformed transportation. Carts pulled by horses could move goods to market faster and further. This helped to stimulate trade and the growth of towns. The switch from ox to horse was not immediate. It was a slow process that took centuries. Horses were more expensive to buy and they required a diet of oats, which meant land had to be set aside specifically to grow their food. For a long time, the slower, cheaper, and more robust ox remained the animal of choice for poorer peasants. But on the larger, more commercially oriented farms in Northern Europe, the horse gradually became the dominant source of power. It was a technological revolution that happened, not in a factory, but in the field. By simply changing the way they attached an animal to a load, medieval people fundamentally increased the amount of power available to them, with consequences that rippled through their entire society. Where exactly was the horse collar invented, and how did it spread across Europe so effectively? Was there resistance to adopting the new technology from farmers who were used to working with oxen? We know horses are faster, but how did the overall cost effectiveness, including feeding and shoeing, really compare to that of an ox in the medieval economy? Did the increased use of horses lead to the development of new tools or plows specifically designed to be pulled at a higher speed? Number 5, was a heavier plow really a better plow? For centuries, farmers around the Mediterranean had used a simple tool called a scratch plow, or ard. It was a light wooden plow, sometimes tipped with iron, that didn't do much more than cut a shallow furrow in the light, dry soils of the south. It didn't turn the soil over. You had to plow a field twice, the second time at a right angle to the first, to really break up the ground. This tool was cheap to make and could be pulled by a single ox or even a donkey. But it was completely useless on the heavy, wet, clay soils of northern Europe. The tool that unlocked the agricultural potential of the north was a much bigger, more complex, and more powerful machine, the heavy moldboard plow. This plow had several key components that the scratch plow lacked. It had a coulter, a vertical blade that acted like a knife to slice down into the sod. It had a horizontal plowshare that cut the soil at the root level, but the most important part was the moldboard, a curved wooden or metal plate behind the plowshare. The moldboard lifted the slice of earth and turned it completely over. This one action had multiple benefits. It buried the weeds and stubble from the previous crop, which would then decompose and act as a fertilizer. It brought fresh nutrients to the surface, and it created the deep furrows that were essential for draining the heavy soil. This new plow was a technological marvel, but it was also a beast. It was heavy and expensive to build. It required a lot of iron, a valuable commodity, and it could not be pulled by a single animal. It required a large team, usually of oxen, sometimes as many as 8. No single peasant family owned a team of 8 oxen. This meant that to use the new plow, people had to cooperate. They had to pool their animals. The plow, in a very real sense, created the communal village. The long, thin strips of land in the medieval open field system are a direct result of this plow. It was hard to turn a team of 8 oxen, so they would plow in a long, straight line. Each family would be assigned a number of these strips to farm. The adoption of the heavy plow, starting in the early Middle Ages, led to a massive increase in food production. It allowed people to cultivate lands that had previously been too difficult to farm. The surplus food it created supported a growing population. Some historians, like the aforementioned Lynn White Jr., have called it one of the most important inventions in European history, on par with the printing press. It literally changed the landscape, creating the ridge and furrow patterns that can still be seen today. And it changed society, forcing a level of cooperation and communal organization that shaped the medieval village for centuries. The heavy plow was not just a tool for farming, it was a tool for building a society. It was a secret written not in a book, but in the very shape of the field. But how did the design of the moldboard evolve? Like, was there one perfect curve they were trying to achieve, or did they have different shapes for different soil types? Who were the craftsmen who built these complex machines, and were they as important as the village blacksmith? Did the use of such a heavy plow over centuries cause long-term soil compaction issues that we can still detect today? If a plow broke in the middle of the plowing season, how catastrophic was that for the village? And what was their emergency plan? Number 4, what did they dig up to make the soil sweet? Animal manure was the farmer's best friend, but there often wasn't enough of it to go around, especially for the large open fields. So medieval farmers had to find other ways to improve their soil. They didn't have chemical analysis to tell them what their soil was lacking, but they had centuries of observation. They knew that some soils were sore and that crops grew poorly in them, and they knew that adding certain substances could make them sweet and fertile again. One of the most important soil amendments was marl. Marl is a type of earth that is rich in calcium carbonate or lime. It's found in natural deposits in many parts of Europe. Farmers would dig up this marl from pits and spread it on their fields. They knew from experience that this made the soil more productive. We now know the science behind this. The calcium carbonate in the marl reduces soil acidity. Many important crops, like wheat and barley, do not grow well in acidic soil. Sweetening the soil with marl raises its pH, making it more alkaline and allowing the plants to access the nutrients in the soil more easily. It was a form of liming, a practice still used in agriculture today. The effort involved was immense. Digging up tons of heavy marl and carting it to the fields was a huge investment of labor. The fact that they did it shows how effective it must have been. Some medieval farming leases even required the tenant to spread a certain amount of marl on the fields each year. They also used other substances. In coastal areas, they would use seaweed. They would gather it from the beaches after storms and spread it on the fields. Seaweed is rich in minerals and breaks down quickly, adding valuable organic matter to the soil. In some places, they used sand or silt from riverbeds to lighten up heavy clay soils. They would even collect the mud from the streets of towns, which was full of organic waste and horse manure, and use it as fertilizer. Nothing was wasted. Another practice was to burn a patch of land. This is sometimes called slash and burn or paring and burning. They would pare off the top layer of turf and vegetation, let it dry, and then burn it in heaps. The ash from these fires was rich in potassium and other minerals. They would then spread the ash over the field as a fertilizer. This provided a quick boost to fertility, but it was not a sustainable long-term solution if overused. It was often used to bring new uncultivated land into production. These practices show a sophisticated understanding of soil management. They were constantly trying to feed the soil, not just take from it. They recognized that different soils needed different treatments. They were carrying out large-scale soil chemistry experiments without any of the formal scientific knowledge. They were listening to the land and responding to what it needed. Their secrets were not just about what to grow, but about how to create and maintain the very foundation of their existence, the soil itself. How did a farmer know how much marl to apply? Was it possible to add too much and damage the soil? Was the right to dig marl a common right, or was it controlled by the lord of the manor? We find the marl pits, but can we analyze the soil in nearby fields to determine how much the marling actually changed the soil chemistry and for how long the effect lasted? Did they discover these techniques by accident, or was it a more deliberate process of experimentation? Number 3, why did they leave a whole field empty? It seems like the most inefficient thing a farmer could do. In a world where every grain of food was precious, why would you take a third of your precious cropland and plant nothing at all? This was the practice of leaving a field fallow. It was a central part of the 3-field system. And far from being wasteful, it was one of the most important secrets to their long-term success. A fallow field was not just an abandoned field, it was an active part of the farming cycle. After a field had been used for 2 years to grow grain and legumes, it was given a year to rest. But it wasn't a passive rest. The fallow field was plowed twice during the year. The first plowing, in the spring, would turn over the weeds before they could set seed. The second plowing, in the summer, would do the same. This had a dual benefit. First, it was a highly effective form of weed control. By plowing the fallow, they were killing off the weeds that would otherwise compete with their crops the following year. The second, and perhaps more important, benefit was that it allowed the soil to recover its fertility. They didn't know the exact science, but they knew it worked. Plowing the soil aerated it. It allowed moisture to penetrate. It encouraged the breakdown of organic matter, which released nutrients back into the soil in a form that the next year's plants could use. And crucially, the fallow field was not fenced off. It was used as common pasture. The village animals would graze on the weeds and stubble that grew on the fallow. As they grazed, they would drop their manure, directly fertilizing the field. So the fallow year was a time for the soil to be cleaned, replenished, and fertilized. This system provided a stability that was essential for survival. By rotating the fields, they avoided exhausting the soil. It was a sustainable system that could be maintained for centuries without a dramatic decline in yields. The fallow field was the engine that powered the whole system. It was the investment they made in the future. By sacrificing 1/3 of their potential harvest each year, they ensured that they would have a harvest for all the years to come. This concept is profoundly different from much of modern agriculture, which often relies on a constant input of chemical fertilizers to keep land in continuous production. The medieval farmer understood that the soil was not a machine that could be run indefinitely. It was a living system that needed time to regenerate. The secret of the fallow field was the wisdom of knowing when to stop, when to let nature do its work. It was a lesson in patience and long-term thinking, born from a deep understanding of the rhythms of the land. Did the length of the fallow period ever vary? Would they ever leave a field fallow for 2 years if the soil was particularly poor? How did they manage the logistics of moving the entire village herd of animals from one fallow field to the next in the rotation? Can we analyze the pollen and seed content of different layers of soil to track the crop rotation cycle, including the types of weeds that grew on the fallow fields? Was there ever a temptation during a famine to break the cycle and plant the fallow field? And what were the long-term consequences if they did? Number 2, what did they eat when the harvest failed? No matter how good their farming methods were, there were years when the harvest failed. A long drought in the summer, too much rain in the autumn, a sudden hailstorm to any of these could be disastrous. The grain in the Lord's granary might last for a while, but what happened when that ran out? What was the ultimate safety net? For the medieval peasant, the answer lay in the wild. The forests, marshes, and hedgerows were their emergency larder. Foraging was not a hobby. It was an essential skill. They had a deep knowledge of wild, edible plants. This was the knowledge that had sustained their hunter-gatherer ancestors, and it had not been forgotten. They knew which roots could be dug up and boiled, which leaves could be added to a pottage, and which berries were safe to eat. They ate acorns from the oak tree. Acorns are high in tannins and bitter to eat, but they knew how to leach them in running water to make them palatable. They could then be dried and ground into a flour to make a coarse but life-saving bread. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a catastrophic event in European history, caused by several years of terrible weather. It chronicles from the time record people eating roots, grasses, and the bark of trees to survive. This famine food was the difference between life and death. The wild was also a source of protein. While the right to hunt large game like deer was usually reserved for the nobility, peasants had ways of catching smaller prey. They could set snares for rabbits and hares, they could catch birds, they could fish in the rivers and ponds, they could collect snails, frogs, and crayfish. This was often done in secret, as poaching on the Lord's land was a serious crime. But in a time of hunger, it was a risk many were willing to take. Archaeological digs at medieval village sites often find the bones of wild fish and small game, evidence of this important supplement to their diet. The hedges that divided fields and lined paths were another important resource. They were not just fences. They were carefully managed ecosystems. They contained hazel trees for nuts, slowberries for making gin-like drinks, hawthorn for its berries, haws, and blackberries. These hedgerows were in effect linear orchards and pantries, providing a reliable source of fruit and nuts in the autumn. This reliance on the wild meant that they had to maintain a healthy and diverse environment. The destruction of woodlands or the draining of a marsh wasn't just an environmental loss. It was the loss of a crucial food source, their insurance policy against starvation. Their survival depended on a landscape that was a mosaic of cultivated fields, managed woodlands, and wild spaces. The secret was not to conquer nature, but to live as a part of it, to understand it, and to know what it could offer when their own fields failed them. How extensive was this knowledge of wild edibles? Could the average peasant identify dozens or even hundreds of different plants? How much of a family's annual calorie intake, even in a good year, came from foraged foods rather than cultivated crops? Were there regional famine food specialties based on the local wild flora and fauna? When a new plant was introduced, how did they determine if it was edible or poisonous? Number one, what was the one thing they knew that we've forgotten? If there is one secret that encompasses all the others, it is this: they paid attention. We live in a world of abundant information but scarce attention. The medieval farmer lived in a world with little information but an abundance of attention. Their survival depended on their ability to observe the world around them with an intensity and a focus that we can barely imagine. That they didn't have a weather app, they had the sky, they didn't have a soil testing kit, they had the feel and smell of the earth in their hands. They didn't have a textbook on animal husbandry. They had the living presence of their animals, whose every mood and sign of sickness they knew intimately. This was a knowledge born of necessity and repetition. Day after day, year after year, they walked the same fields. They saw the subtle changes in the soil from one end of a strip to the other. They knew the spot that was always a bit damp in the spring. They knew the side of the hill that caught the morning sun. They knew the sound of a healthy beehive and the look of a wheat stalk that was suffering from rust. This was not data, it was a deep holistic understanding. The historian Georges Duby, in his work on the medieval economy, talks about the peasant's slow moving time, a rhythm of life dictated by the seasons, not by the clock. This slow time allowed for a level of observation that is impossible in our fast-paced world. They were not scientists, but they were relentless experimenters. Every time they saved the seeds from a slightly better plant, they were conducting a genetic experiment. Every time they tried adding a new type of manure to a patch of soil, they were testing a hypothesis. Their laboratory was the field, and their experiments ran for generations. This knowledge was practical, local, and specific. It was not a universal theory of agriculture. It was the knowledge of how to grow food right here, on this piece of land, in this climate. We have replaced this kind of intimate, personal knowledge with a more powerful but also more abstract scientific knowledge. We can analyze the genetic code of a plant, but we may not know how to tell if it needs water just by the look of its leaves. We can model the climate on a supercomputer, but we may not notice the subtle shift in the wind that signals a coming storm. The medieval farmers' knowledge was embedded in their senses and in their bodies. They knew things in a way that we have forgotten how to know. This is not to romanticize their lives. Their existence was brutal, short, and filled with hardship, but in their struggle to survive, they developed a relationship with the land that was profoundly deep and intelligent. They understood that they were part of a complex system, not its masters. They knew that their well-being was inseparable from the health of their soil, their animals, and their community. Perhaps their greatest secret was not a specific technique like the three-field system or the heavy plow. It was a mindset of careful observation, of respect for natural limits, and of a deep, humbling awareness that their life depended entirely on the bounty of the earth and their wisdom in tending to it. What would happen if a modern agronomist and a 13th century peasant were to stand in the same field? What would each of them see that the other would miss? How much of this deep sensory knowledge can ever be recovered through historical texts and archaeology, and how much of it died with the last people who lived that life? If we were stripped of all our modern technology, how many of our secrets for survival would actually work? And in our search for a more sustainable future, what is the one thing they knew that we most desperately need to relearn?